I have to second what Susan said. It's so great to see people coming on the line from all over the country, and then seeing where you are on the map visually is just exciting. So on behalf of the National Center on After School and Summer Enrichment, welcome to the first of 2 webinars about what was learned and shared during a social emotional peer learning group, what we call the SEL-PLG, with 10 state teams over the past year, and our focus was on strengthening systems and supports to build positive social emotional climates in out-of-school time. Our second webinar in this series is scheduled on November 7th, and that one will include state systems, partnerships, and funding, the building of staff capacity to improve social emotional climates, and mental health consultation. So if you haven't signed up for that one, you may want to do that too. I am joined today by Susan O'Connor, and she's also from the NCASE team, and we were co-facilitators on the SEL-PLG. Tamsin Oakes from Kentucky is with Save the Children. Tamsin was the team lead from Kentucky during the SEL-PLG, and she will share promising practices from her state. We have a nice geographic sense of where people are joining from, and now if you would please take a moment to indicate what organization you represent. There's a poll in the middle of your screen, and if you could just indicate on the poll as well as the chat pod if you choose, that would be great. So we're seeing quite a few 21st Century Community Learning Center program staff and licensing. And people are coming in. There are about 75 of us on this call right now, and it looks like we are about halfway there. So if you want to plug in, if you haven't, but that looks pretty good. That is very, very helpful. All right. Well, welcome everybody. It's nice to see you all. Places and roles. Here's so in our agenda today. In our agenda today, we're going to present on what was learned and shared by state teams participating in the SEL peer learning group. And this will also include an SEL brief that we recently published. And you'll hear about how the cross-sector state teams assessed current status on SEL and about their connected action planning process. Next, we will cover some information on adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, trauma-informed and healing-centered approaches, and culturally responsive practices, grounded in a state example from Kentucky. We will pause for discussions throughout and hope that you will participate and share your SEL experiences and resources and ask questions. SEL resources from the NCASE library and other related resources will be interspersed throughout the webinar so that you will have at your fingertips access to current SEL information. The PowerPoint and the brief are in the bottom underneath the chat pod. You'll see that there are the downloadable versions of those, and so you don't have to take too many notes because a lot of this will be right at your fingertips, as I said. So now I'm going to pass this over to Susan, who will share about the learning group and the brief and some of the work that was done. Susan?
Thanks so much, Suzanne, and welcome to this webinar, everyone, on this early fall day. I'm cozy in Massachusetts. It's raining, and I'm trying to kind of embrace this fall weather. Sad to see the summer go, but really happy that we have such a wonderful group on this afternoon. So much of what we're sharing today is the result of this peer learning group that Suzanne mentioned that focused on social emotional learning. So I want to tell you just a little bit about the peer learning group. There were 10 states that participated. The learning group met 5 times between December and May. And each state built a cross-sector planning team that completed a questionnaire at the beginning of the PLG. And the questionnaire was designed to help them assess what their state had in place, and also for many states it helped them realize that there were things in place that they hadn't recognized but were in another sector or organization. Throughout the 5 sessions, they worked on creating an action plan, which the teams are working on implementing now. Each of the teams created a goal in those action plans to strengthen training and technical assistance on social emotional learning, which I think really speaks to the fact that we're well aware that one of our priorities needs to be building the capacity for staff to be able to support social emotional outcomes for youth. In addition, some states are working on developing resources or guidebooks or frameworks for their states. Other states are working on linking SEL to their quality improvement efforts and really just interested in how deep that overlap is between ramping up what we do on social emotional learning and increasing our quality. Others are also working on funding, policy, and legislative action steps. So the state teams worked on action planning through all 5 sessions, and many of them would meet in between the sessions where they would work on the plan, on what they had in place, and how they could really work collaboratively to create that. There were other strategies that were identified, and I just want to share a few of those other strategies. New York plans to collect ACEs data, that's Adverse Childhood Experience data, at the county level to help drive their planning process around supporting children that have had adverse childhood experiences. Georgia plans to hold a roundtable discussion about the mental health needs of youth. Oklahoma plans to increase the mental health supports for school-age children, and you'll hear more about that in the November webinar. And other states are planning to revise their program standards or add social emotional learning criteria to their standards. NCASE is going to be convening meetings of the state team leaders so that they can provide peer support to each other as they implement their action plans. And we just want to have you think as we go through this webinar today that you may want to think about developing an action step or perhaps a broader plan as a result of these 2 webinars to strengthen the systems and supports on SEL at your state. And we really encourage you to do that in a cross-sector planning process. So let's take a moment to look at what those cross-sector planning teams look like for the 10 states that participated. Every state team had representation from their Child Care Development Fund agency. They were also strongly encouraged to include their state after-school network, a representative from the Department of Education or 21st Century Community Learning Centers. Some states also included representation from higher education, from child care resource and referral agencies, from local providers and tribal representatives. I want to just give you an example of the composition of the New York State team. They had very diverse representation and included a broad range of organizations and professional roles. The CCDF agency, their Ed department, their 21st Century state coordinator, their state after-school network, the New York State Network for Youth Success, the CCR&R agency, the University of Rochester, a community schools coordinator, and the New York City Department of Youth and Community Development, Prevent Child Abuse, a health education center, etc. And the takeaway here really is, if you're creating a planning team in your state to advance social-emotional learning systems, you just really want to consider bringing together a representative stakeholders from this range of organizations. And what a number of states did is they might have started out with a smaller team, but as they have moved into their implementation phase, they have been adding other stakeholders, which has been enriching their process. So let's take a moment to talk about this state team questionnaire process. As team members filled out their team questionnaire, they reported back that it was so helpful, that it really helped them to learn what was in place in their state. And they were often surprised to find that one of the organizations on the team had an existing resource that they hadn't been aware of. And many of the states have taken those existing resources and adopted them in full or adapted them so that it would be useful for all the sectors involved in the planning process. The team leaders surveyed all team members to see if any organization, for example, had developed quality standards or professional competencies, or they asked what training and technical assistance was in place, and in many cases they even looked at what was in place in their state in the early childhood arena. And so many of them are building on that existing training to bring into the school-age sectors. So this really creates for us some efficiencies that we're not in a place of recreating the wheel. Many of the states explored what policies are in place to sustain their SEL efforts and what legislation and funding could support their efforts. And several states like Kentucky realized that the Birth to 5 arena had so many resources on trauma-informed care and culturally responsive practices, and realized that school age needed to be more intentional too about building on these resources and bringing them out to the field. So let's take a look at the Voices from the Field brief. This brief is available, and as Suzanne said, it's just down right under the chat bar in the left column. You'll see the link for the NCASE SEL practice brief. And this is a picture of what the brief looks like. And it really captures the lessons that we learned from the PLG. It provides information that was shared out on ACEs and trauma-informed and healing-centered practice, which we'll hear more about in a minute. It includes resources for positive social-emotional climates and building culturally responsive practice. We had a big focus in the brief on mental health and mental health consultation and suspension and expulsion, which we'll focus on a lot in our November 7th webinar. And we spotlighted some wonderful state examples from Kentucky, Oklahoma, and Vermont. And there were mentions of a number of other great state examples. So it really can bring in promising practices from the field for you to consider as you do your own planning. Okay, I just want to take a very brief moment to review the definition on social emotional learning, which comes from CASEL, the Center for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. Their definition is that SEL is the process through which children and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills necessary for self-awareness, which is the ability to understand one's emotions and how they influence behavior. Self-management, the ability to calm one's self down when upset, to set goals and work toward them, and to manage and control emotions. Social awareness, the ability to recognize what is appropriate in a setting and to empathize with others. Responsible decision-making, the ability to make decisions that take into account social standards, consequences, and context. And the all-important relationship skills, the ability for them to communicate well, to listen and to respond appropriately, and to negotiate conflict. Before we move into a discussion, we want to share with you this link to the NCASE library. NCASE is continually updating the library for the field to include recent research, issue briefs, webinars, state data profiles. The library is organized by topic areas like culturally responsive practice, health, safety, and licensing, professional development. So you're able to click on the link, go in, and if you want to just look, for example, for everything we have on social emotional learning, you would click on the category supportive learning environments, and we have over 40 resources in the library, and we'll give you some highlights today, but we really just want to alert you to the fact that there are many, many more resources on SEL and other topics in the library. So here's the first batch of resources we would just like to highlight. The After School Alliance had developed a really nice issue brief that says that after school provides the ideal opportunity really for working on SEL, that we have always done this, but that we're all working toward being more intentional. CASEL's 2018 state scorecard is listed here, where it shows you where your state is at with carrying out SEL initiatives. And the next resource is from the American Institute for Research, AIR, on how to support SEL and after school. The fourth brief is the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development, the really wonderful commission report from the Aspen Institute that came out this year called From a Nation at Risk to a Nation at Hope. And it could be great for you to be sure to read that and some related resources on the Aspen site, because we're going to have Priscilla Little on the November webinar talking about that very important work, groundbreaking work really, that came out this year. And the final resource that I want to just mention is one about the importance of putting relationships first, creating connections that help young people thrive. So that is the end of our look at resources right now. We're going to move right now into a discussion. And the way this works, if you haven't experienced this before on a webinar, is that in a minute, Preeti, our colleague from NCASE, is going to pull up chat pods that give you a space to answer any one of these 4 questions. What is happening in your state right now to support SEL? So you have a chance to share with other states what you're doing. They have a chance to notice if somebody's doing something that they're about to step into, and they might like to reach out to you and learn from you about how you're doing that. The second question is, what is needed to move the SEL agenda forward, and what might your next steps be? The third question is, who would you want to include in your state planning team, or perhaps you're representing a city or region. You could have a smaller focus on that planning team. And fourth, but very importantly, how would you encourage equity and diversity and the SEL work that you will do? And with that, Preeti, if you could bump us to the chat pod, that would be great. And you can answer these questions in whatever order makes sense to you. It could be you want to start with the third question, or you want to start right away on the first question, and we're going to give about 7 or 8 minutes for people to weigh in. Thanks for these great ideas that are coming on here. I see that Suzanne is asking Erin to say a little bit more about the SEL 21st Century Community Learning Center grant. And in DC, Paula says she's the case manager and the SEL instructor for out of school time, and doing some work, some good work there. In the second box on what's needed to move the SEL agenda forward, Marissa is saying we really need to work more on adult social emotional learning competence. You know, we need to get the oxygen mask on the staff, and if people have any specific ideas about what pieces of that you would want to advance, you could add that to the box. In the box about who you would include on your state team, I like that Angela says educators, kids, parents, administrators, really including youth in this planning process, including families, including schools. It's great. And on equity and diversity, there's some nice ideas coming in here. I also want to point out that for those of you who get the National After School Alliance, National After School Association quarterly journal, they have a focus this month on equity and diversity with some nice tips for staff development. Stacy's reminding us of a basic thing here to have books and materials that really are reflective of the children we're serving. Oh, Nicole, I see that in the first box you put that training in a cohort is starting up in New Hampshire. Love to hear a little more about that. I see some people are still typing, so I want to give it another minute or two. One of the great things about the recording process for this webinar is that we do get to save the ideas that came up in the chat pods so that you can refer back to them. Robbie's mentioning in the equity and diversity box that we need to ensure diversity among our board members, for those doing our staff training. And Carol's saying in the moving forward box, we really need funding for mental health professionals in schools and after-school programs. There is, we'll talk more about this in November, but there is just a lot of money going into early childhood mental health consultation, but not as much into after-school. Typically, many of us are relying on mental health professionals that are in the schools that we're sometimes housed by. Lots of great ideas coming up. Thank you. I would say everybody add one more idea if you have one more, and then we'll be moving on. These are such good ideas. Bianca suggesting more peer educator curricula. That sounds great. And Nicole's saying, very importantly, that we need to make sure we're working on getting buy-in from the folks who make the decisions so we can build our case with stats, stories, reasons why. Excellent. Okay. Well, thanks everybody so much. It's wonderful to be able to see what other states are doing, and I'm very happy now to turn this back over to Suzanne, who's going to talk with us about adverse childhood experiences, trauma-informed practice. So, Suzanne.
Thank you, Susan. And yeah, that was a really rich sharing. And as Susan said, that will be transcribed and sent to you so you can go back and see who's doing what activities and maybe reach out to each other. So we're going to talk about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and these are defined as potentially traumatic events that can have negative and lasting effects on well-being. These experiences can include events like physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction such as mental illness, an incarcerated relative, domestic violence, substance abuse, and divorce. In addition, research links social determinants such as poverty and racism as potential contributing factors. So there's a lot that can go into creating this kind of experience for youth. And the attention to the ACEs phenomenon comes from the original ACEs study that had 17,000 participants, which was a joint venture of the Center for Disease Control and Kaiser Permanente from 1995 to 97. An acute single incident or complex, chronic, varied, and or multiple incidents of trauma may lead to toxic stress, which can negatively affect brain architecture and chemistry. What happens then is that toxic stress elevates the stress hormones, which can have a profound effect on all domains of brain development. This leads to changes in neurodevelopment and impacts cognition, memory, and visual processing. It can produce symptoms of dysregulation and lead to a fight, flight, or freeze response. And it can also lead to health risk factors, which can lead to disease, disability, and even early death. So you've got the external input from some of the adverse experiences, and then the inner experience where the child is, the stress is affecting their development. And then for all of us who have worked with youth, this is what you might see externally. You might observe that youth who are trauma impacted, will show a range of symptoms like difficulty paying attention, being withdrawn, sad, anxious, frequent fights, changes in school performance. And so the question then becomes, what can we do? So as our understanding of ACEs and trauma grows, some states are adopting trauma-informed practice like Tennessee and Oklahoma to create environments that can lead to recovery. They are creating frameworks that can help integrate this knowledge into policies, procedures, and practices to make sure they are working toward healing and avoiding re-traumatization. A trauma-informed approach places emphasis on creating safe environments that build on trusting relationships, encourage peer support and collaboration. It builds youth empowerment, voice, and choice with a focus on culturally responsive practice. Sean Ginwright, professor of education at San Francisco State University, suggests that we take a step even beyond this trauma-informed practice, and that practice focuses on what happened to me, and he's suggesting we focus on what is right with me. This approach is strengths-based and focused on the possibilities and not the pathology. So as one of his youth said, I am more than what happened to me, which is, I think this youth said this as he was talking about trauma-informed approach, and it really was a critical turning point for him. There is also a focus in the healing-centered approach on the social toxins or structural violence that a whole community can experience. So when there are blocked opportunities for a whole group or community, it can create hopelessness, and hopelessness is a predictor of violent behavior and depression. So he suggests that we work to prepare staff to have conversations with youth about this exposure to social toxins and to work on building hope for individuals and for the group and the entire community, and do this through a future goal orientation, creating pathways of opportunity and the agency to stay on that path. We have a few more resources to share with you. The first one is a webinar to train after-school providers trauma-informed practice, and it was developed by the Illinois Quality After School. The second resource is a keynote address on healing-centered practice by Sean Ginwright, who we were just talking about with the healing-centered approach. The third is a resource guide on culturally responsive practice for community-based organizations. And the final resource is a brief produced this year by NCASE on ACEs and school-age populations. So I hope that you find those useful. We're going to move into another point in our time together where you can share some of your own experiences and resources. So we're going to go back into chat pods, and we're going to ask you to respond to what your state, territory, tribe, organization, and I think there are many people on the call today who are from programs, so let's add that to this list. And what you're doing around, first, ACEs and PACEs, secondly, trauma-informed and healing-centered approaches. There will be an area to respond to culturally responsive practice. And then if you have resources you'd like to share, please add those into the fourth box. And it's the same order. You can enter into it in any order that you'd like to. Preeti, can we go to those chat pods, please? Thank you. A LionQuest SEL program, Erin has posted under resources to share. I think that there's a lot of work going on with ACEs, PACEs, that would be really interesting for us to learn about as a continued learning community. Okay, so there's Julie is talking about training for 21st century program staff. And then there's some identification that there's not a lot going on. And sometimes the not a lot going on can be that it's an opportunity for pockets of practice that are happening to start to communicate more and come around the table, because sometimes there are things going on and maybe not everybody knows about it. There are work groups, Rochelle is saying, for after-school leaders and directors on leading and coaching in a trauma-informed way. Rochelle, would you remind us which state you're in? Nicole talks about trauma-informed care conversations and training. So it seems like trauma-informed focus is really gaining some momentum here. And Rochelle, thank you. You're in California. Okay. All right. And Erin is saying that it sounds like at the program level and hopefully including families, there are ways in which they sit and talk about it would be their culture, I'm imagining, Erin. And there are some curriculum suggestions, Record Scholastic, Overcoming Obstacles. Right. Training for 21st Century program in Vermont. And Linda, you're talking about the ACEs and PACEs. I'm wondering, would that be something that other states would be able to learn from? Would it be a document that would be available to other people? Okay, partnering with local clinics, behavioral health professionals to educate the staff on trauma-informed care. That's a great partnership. Macy is sending links. Thank you for trauma-informed practice. Nicole, a link. Wonderful, Weichart Center. Yeah, good. That's a really good resource. All right, we're going to give just another minute here and then move on. All right, let's see. I think maybe we will. I still see a little bit of typing going on. So random acts of kindness for curriculum, diversity among staff, so including diverse staff and training for staff. Great. All right. Thank you. So if you could bring us back to the presentation, Preetay. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for all of those good resources and ideas and responses. So at this time, Tamsin Oakes is going to be presenting from Kentucky. She's a program specialist for the international nonprofit Save the Children. Previous to this role, she served as project director of 21st Century Community Learning Centers in rural eastern Kentucky and was the director or the network lead of the statewide after-school network Kentucky Out-of-School Alliance, shaping after-school and summer education policy. And so Tamsin is going to take some time to share the work that's going on in Kentucky, and as there will be Q&A included. And if you have questions as she's presented and you want to put them in the chat pod, when we get to the Q&A, we can pull those questions up for Tamsin. So Tamsin, thank you so much. We're glad to have you share your promising practices.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm so happy anytime I get a chance to brag on Kentucky and the good things that we have going on here. So as Suzanne had said, formerly I was the director of the Kentucky Out-of-School Alliance, and in that role I acted as the team lead for the Kentucky team in the recent professional learning group that just wrapped up a couple months back. It was a fantastic experience, and one of the things that we learned about that had already been in place in Kentucky, but I had not been familiar with up until that point, was the Kentucky Strengthening Families approach. It was developed in partnership with the Kentucky Department for Public Health and the Governor's Office of Early Childhood. And so that's what I wanted to share with you all this afternoon. A couple of things just right off the bat that I wanted to put on the table. The kind of the whole idea behind Kentucky Strengthening Families is as more and more research was coming out about adverse childhood experiences and trauma-informed care, and we saw more and more of our families in Kentucky being affected by the economy and the opioid crisis. We were kind of compelled to, you saw more and more organizations coming together to talk about what can we do about this, what can we do to support this. And what we kind of realized fairly quickly was there were a lot of people that were doing a lot of good things, but we weren't getting the results that we would have hoped for because there were, in many cases, a duplication of services, and in a lot of cases, there were service gaps. And because we weren't talking with each other and communicating effectively, we just really weren't serving our families and our communities to the best of our ability. And we felt that we could have had a bigger return on the investment of time and energy that we were putting into this. So we came together and we developed this Kentucky Strengthening Families approach. And the idea behind it is we wanted to align practice and implementation with the developmental science. And so we wanted this approach to be research informed on all of the new research that was coming out about working with families and how to support them. We wanted to build protective factors and not just focus on reducing risk or mitigating risk. We felt like being able to have kind of that strengths-based approach was going to be important to success. This was a change in the relationship that we had with parents and youth up to that point. And you still see it to this day. We're not exactly where we want to be, but what we had seen and what we still do sometimes see is that we had a curriculum or a program, and it was kind of a cookie cutter, one-size-fits-all approach. And what we came to understand was that's just really not appropriate for all families. Families are not one size fits all, and we wanted to be sure that whatever services we were doing or however we approached this work, that we were giving families what I like to call the just right support. So the right amount of support and the right support that they need. Not too much support and not trying to give them resources that they don't really need all that much. And then, as I'd already kind of mentioned, this is an approach. It's not a model or a program or a curriculum. This is really almost just a change in the way that we think about engaging with families and supporting families, and a change in the way that we implement programs that maybe are already in existence. So we kind of had three goals that we felt like we needed to address. First, we felt like we needed to adopt a common language so that we were all using the same language. I come from a school background, an education background, and so we tend to refer to social emotional learning, but my colleagues at the Department for Public Health were talking about social emotional health and trauma-informed approach versus healing-centered approach or whole child approach, whatever you want to call it. We wanted to adopt common language so that we were all on the same page. We wanted to connect with each other because, as I said, we realized that there were many different agencies doing good work, and so we wanted to be able to refer families to those agencies as appropriate. And then we wanted to be more intentional in our support, and we wanted to come together so that there wasn't a duplication of services nor a gap in services. And so this is kind of, if you look at the octopus-looking thing that is on the left side of the screen, that's kind of what it looked like before. And in many cases, that's still what it looks like. As I said, we're not 100% where we want to be. This is a work in progress. But you had the child and the family, and you had all of these different agencies that wanted to help, all had good intentions, but it was kind of all over the place. It was a throwing spaghetti against the wall and see what sticks approach. Our hope for the future is that it's much more intentional. It's much more wraparound services, whole child approach. There's increased communication. We're all working together, and the child and the family are really at the center. And so it's very much centered on their strengths, their needs, how we can support them, and we don't have to worry about stepping on each other's toes or any one agency getting the glory or doing the lion's share of the work, because we're all communicating and we're all working together to support these families. And we kind of realized that, I think we all kind of had a light bulb moment in that, okay, I work for the school system, but the families and the children that I work with are the same families and children that the Department for Public Health is working with right down the road. And it's the same family that, United Way is working with, or the, family court services. And so doesn't it make sense for us to get on the same page about these families so that we can really give them the support that they need? So this is kind of the, I guess you could call it life cycle. When this first started, we were thinking from, it was kind of like birth to age 5. And then as the schools, we got more and more partners from the school systems, it was birth to age 8. And then we kind of realized, oh, okay, we really need to be thinking of this as a like prenatal to young adult approach. So that's kind of what this graphic shows. You can see that Kentucky Strengthening Families, there on the top left, you've got a pregnant young mother, and that's kind of where we start, is helping them understand what can they do, what can they build on, what strengths do they have that they can build on to help give their child the best possible start in life, and making sure that those young parents are supported. And then as you go around in the circle, you see the young family there and continuing to support them, and their strengths may have matured, but then they might have some new challenges. And so we might need to build up their protective factors in other areas as they continue to grow and as their life changes and their challenges change. Then we have Youth Thrive, which is pretty much the exact same structure as Kentucky Strengthening Families, but it's geared towards youth specifically. And so it's helping youth develop these protective factors that can mitigate risk and help ensure that they've got healthy development. And then you can see there, the last photo in the bottom left, you've got young adults, and a lot of those young adults will soon be starting families of their own. And so it really is a wraparound approach that's going to be appropriate no matter where they are in their life cycle. So these are the 6 guiding premises that, as a service worker who has kind of bought into the Kentucky Strengthening Families approach, this is what we want them to think about. Premise number 1 is about self-awareness, and we know that people are best supported by those who understand and recognize the importance of self-awareness and self-care in their own practice, and we realize that all of us are carrying some baggage. All of us might have had some trauma in our life, and being aware of what are our triggers, what are we capable of giving, and when do we need to maybe bring in some help and some support or refer people out if there's something that we are not capable of providing for a family. Premise number 2, this is a strengths-based approach. You're going to hear me say that a lot because we believe that focusing on the strengths that a family has that can be built upon is a more effective approach than just trying to address the symptoms of trauma or the challenges that they're dealing with. The old approach, where you're just dealing with challenges and issues as they come up, is kind of just like constantly putting out small fires rather than giving them the tools that they need to be able to manage some of these challenges and issues on their own. Premise number 3 is about relationships, and we believe that people are best supported by providers who understand that attachments, connections, and relationships are the primary source of growth and learning. No man stands alone, and we all need some support at some point in our lives, so that should not be something that is stigmatized. Premise number 4 addresses race, privilege, and power. And so just like I mentioned before, we all need to be self-aware of maybe some of the challenges or issues or baggage that we carry around with us on a day-to-day basis. We also need to be aware of the role that race and racism and bias and privilege and power plays in healthy development. Premise number 5 is about being trauma-informed. And notice it does say trauma-informed and not trauma-focused because, again, we're not focusing on the negative. We're focusing on the positive and building up the positive. But that idea is that people are best supported by service providers who understand the need to use trauma-informed practice methods, and that trauma response focuses on building resiliency and the ability to adapt and deal. And then finally, premise number 6, we want to be sure that we are being culturally responsive. We believe that people are best supported by service providers who are culturally responsive and take into account their own culture and the culture of the families and communities that they serve. So I've mentioned protective factors a few times, and that is the building up those protective factors is the focus of the Kentucky Strengthening Families approach. And so here are the 6 protective factors that we have adopted. Some states have 5. I've seen 5 protective factors. Here in Kentucky, we have 6. Those are the knowledge of child development. We want families to learn how their children grow and develop. Social connections, so families have friends that they can count on, and that having positive relationships that provide emotional, informational, and spiritual support is paramount to healthy development. Parental resilience, it's that ability to bounce back and manage stress. Everybody has challenges, everybody has issues, and our ability to adapt and deal with those is a big indicator in whether or not we are able to facilitate healthy development of families and children. Concrete support in times of need, it's just that idea that families get the assistance that they need to meet basic needs. They have access to resources that address their basic needs and minimize stress caused by challenges. Social and emotional competence of children is, in broad terms, families teaching children how to have healthy relationships. And the idea is that family and child interactions that help children develop the ability to recognize, communicate, and regulate their emotions. And then finally, nurturing and attachment. And the idea is that families ensure that children feel loved and safe. We know that a child's early experience of being nurtured and developing a bond with caring adults is necessary for the healthy development of that child. Oh, sorry. So one of the things that, so that's all for the slides, but one of the points that I wanted to point out, because this is all kind of theoretical, and so I kind of wanted to give you an idea of what do we mean when we talk about a common language, and what kind of partnerships are we talking about. So an example might be under common service delivery methods, we refer a lot to at-risk families or at-risk youth. And through this approach, through the Kentucky Strengthening Families approach, we believe that all families have issues, all families have challenges, all families have strengths. And it kind of takes away that stigma of the label of, ACEs or trauma or whatever the case might be. And I think when you are able to approach the work from the idea that, hey, we all need a little bit of help sometimes, and we all have strengths that we can build on, you're immediately introducing equity into the work that you're doing. Another example might be, here's what I have to offer you because this is what we do. And that's kind of under the old model. Under this new model, we try to think in terms of what can I do to support you? What do you need from me? If it's not something that is within their wheelhouse, then because of these connections that we've made and because we're all working together with these families and community members, then we can make a referral for them or we can make a connection for them. And then finally, another example I wanted to give you, this idea of I can fix this for you. And again, I think we all have our heart in the right place, but sometimes when we're not giving the just right amount of support, or if we are, if we're not working toward building up their protective factors and not taking a strengths-based approach, it can actually backfire on us and we can create a sense of dependency rather than empowerment. And so we want to avoid that. And so under this new model, we want to use the language of you can do it and I can help. So that was all that I just wanted to give some concrete examples of that. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Suzanne to see if we have any questions.
Great. Tamsin, that was so rich and so interesting, and I love the way you ended with you can do it and I can help, so such a strengths-based kind of language to wrap around this. So if you have a question, please post it in the chat pods for Tamsin, and I know, Susan, you had a question that you wanted to ask, if you want to jump in here.
I do, and that will give people a chance to maybe type their question into the chat pod for this great framework. My question is this is such a wonderful framework and great to have everybody sort of moving in the same direction, to have a real consistent idea about how to move forward and to have it be so strengths-based. But my question is this: how is progress being tracked on this? Is it being tracked by the protective factors, or are you allowing the various partners to shape their own way to track progress? How is that happening, Tamsin?
Yeah, it really is up to it's up to the various different partners. And so, as I said, it's not a program, it's not a curriculum, it's an approach. And so a lot of agencies, they may already have their way of working with families. They may already have a program or a curriculum that they are using. We didn't want to give them yet another program for them to try to squeeze into their day. We didn't want them to feel like they had to give up something that they really liked or that they felt was working for them. It's really just that shift in our way of thinking and maybe the way that we communicate with families, and the way that we communicate with our community partners. And so a lot of them, they have their own ways of tracking it. And so it might be the number of, we might see fewer referrals to Child Protective Services. We might see people taking advantage, families taking advantage of, or more often of the resources that are available to them through their community. And it really, we're not, the people who are engaged in this, we're not really tracking this. We're training people in this approach, and they track it however they feel is appropriate for their organization or agency.
It's wonderful. It's so great. And I just want one quick follow-up question, and then we'll see if others weigh in here. But I'm just wondering, it seems like this paradigm shift that you're working on to move toward away from what's wrong with somebody to how can I help, it seems like it would be very energizing. Have you found it energizing, or has there been a resistance to this new overarching concept?
We've had both. Both of those things are true. We've had some resistance, which I think is natural, but then we've also had people who, once. Okay, well, I'll speak for myself. Coming from the school age side of things and working in the school system, this kind of framework was already in existence and has been for the last 5 or 6 years, and I was not aware of it until just the last year. And it has really changed my approach in the way I support the school districts that I work with in rural southeastern Kentucky. I think if you're going to put the time and energy into something, this is what I think people realize. They were already putting so much time and energy into trying to help families, because we all want to do that. And we want to help the children that we're working with. And we put a lot of time and energy into making that work. And it's really disheartening when you feel like you are trying your hardest, and then for whatever reason, it's just not working. You're not getting the results that you would like to see. Your children are not school ready. You're not seeing instances of abuse or neglect decrease. So when we just kind of said, okay, let's get more intentional about this, and if we're going to be putting the time, you can either put the time and energy in on the back end, or you can put it into the front end and really increase your return on investment. And so when I had that light bulb moment, and I realized, okay, if I just am a little bit more intentional at the get-go, and I work with some of my community partners, and we come together to make sure that we are talking to each other and really working with each other and being intentional in our approach, then we started seeing the return on investment that we had wanted to see. And so, yeah, it took a little bit more time in the beginning. It took us having a few extra phone calls or sending a few extra emails or going to a meeting, but it was worth it. I would not want to go back to the siloed approach because that wasn't working for us. And so why waste your time and energy doing it that way? And so we have had some resistance from the get-go, because I think anytime you're wanting to change people's minds, you're going to have that. But for the communities that have adopted this, we hear just really glowing results, and they talk about how the families are, they feel supported, and how they've got fantastic partnerships that we did not have before with pediatricians and libraries and the family courts. And I hadn't worked with those people before in the school system, so it was wonderful to not only get to know those people and what supports they offered, but to be able to let them know what we could do from the school-age perspective to help support these families.
Thank you. Such a great sort of example of the change process where, there's going to be some resistance even for a great idea. So thank you.
Okay. So Stacy does have a question about people being stuck in the mindset of fixing instead of helping, and I think that some of what you shared, Tamsin, addresses that, but would there be anything else you would want to add?
I'll say it's something I think that gets easier with practice. I think it's, I know in education it's a thing that we tend to do a lot with the kids. We want to give answers. We want to do something for them, and it's easier to do that sometimes than it is to teach somebody how to do things for themselves. But with that said, once you practice that mindset and you practice, you kind of have to recognize, okay, I am not the end-all be-all for everybody, and I can play a role, but this is an adult, and I need to respect their strengths. I need to respect their abilities, and their life may not look like mine, and their relationship with their families may not look like the relationship that I have with my family, but I need to come to this person from a place of respect. And if you come from a place of respect first and recognizing that everybody has strengths that can be built on, it's a lot easier, because then you're not, I think it's more difficult to remove yourself from the equation or take a step back if you're constantly focusing on the weaknesses or the gaps. But if you focus on the strengths, it's a lot easier for you to say, okay, you've got this. I'm here to support you, but you've got this.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tamsin, for such a thorough and thoughtful presentation representing all of the thorough and thoughtful work that's been going on in Kentucky. So we're ready to move into our next chat and discussion. So here are the different strands that we're going to talk about now online. So during this time together, what did you learn or relearn? That will be in one of the boxes. And then what is one thing that you plan to do following this webinar? What one action step can you take to ground some of what you've learned or jumped out at you or seemed like a good idea to try out? And then what questions do you still have? So Preeti, if we can go to those chats, that would be great. All right, so again, enter in any order you'd like to. Relearned ACEs, but what would like to include in programs? Yes. Now, sometimes they say you have to hear things 3 times, or you have to come back to learning and, in a spiral, apply it more deeply each time.
And just so, Erin, you know, in the NCASE library, there our director, Katari Coleman, has 2 issue briefs in there on ACEs. So it's another great resource for pulling information that you could include into a training. Just want to be sure to mention that.
All right, and I'd also like to mention that the PowerPoint slides will be sent out after this webinar, and we will also be working on the recording, and when that is ready to go, we will follow up with the recorded version.
Oh, Tamsin, you might be interested to note that Aaron wrote in here that I think I'm up at Rochelle, crosswalking our Strengthening Families efforts with the presentation that you did to find areas to expand in our own work. So I think you've planted a nice seed for another state. That's wonderful. And Stacy seemed to really like that concept of thinking that our job is to support, not fix, not only in her job, but in her family. So I love that. Julia, I just want to point out, I see that you said you relearned the SEL definitions. And in a conversation Suzanne and I had with our guest speaker for our November session, she just really reminded us that there are a number of sort of frameworks and definitions out there. So we just picked one. We picked CASEL, but there are multiple ones out there that really can inform the work.
All right, and I think that who wanted to enter has entered information, and so let's go to back to our presentation with Susan.
Okay, well, it's my job just to do a little bit of wrap up here before we close out the webinar. And I want to just start by once again thanking Tamsin Oaks from Kentucky for sharing with us so deeply about their Strengthening Families framework and about how some of the ins and outs of implementing it in the out of school time world was just wonderful. I also just want to take a moment to thank my co-facilitator, Suzanne Birdsall-Stone. We've been working together on this social emotional learning work for the last, I don't know, 8 to 10 months. We started our careers out as 21st Century Community Learning Center directors back in 2000. So it's been just wonderful to have this chance to work on this part of what I think can be one of the best ways in which to advance quality and improve outcomes for kids. So I've just really enjoyed our work together, Suzanne. It's just been great.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to remind people that there will be, as we said, a second webinar on social emotional learning. It will be on November 7th, same time of the day, 3 to 4:30. We're going to focus on social emotional supports and programs and mental health supports. We're going to have some very exciting state examples to share on building staff capacity, but we're also being joined by Priscilla Little, who can talk with us a lot about what's been happening nationally on this with the Aspen report, with the Science of Learning and Development work that's about to come out. So we have a very great program planned for November 7th to build on what you learned today. In addition, I wanted to just make an announcement, and Kate has just posted in the chat the link to registering for the November 7th webinar. But I also want to just let you know that there is going to be a series of webinars that are being sponsored jointly by the Infant Toddler Specialist Network and NCASE. And we're going to be on November 13th doing a presentation about family child care and how to support those providers. 24% of school-age kids that are in in subsidized slots are being served in family child care. And, you know, we're going to talk quite a lot about how we make sure we can meet the individual needs of school-age children in that space, something that sometimes gets neglected, and so we're happy to put the spotlight on that. So that's November 13th. These are all happening from 1 to 2:30. Then December 11th, there's going to be another panel session on how to incorporate equity into all the quality and quality improvement work you're doing. And on January 8th, there will be a webinar on social emotional learning and some focus on ACEs. Again, each one of those webinars is followed the following week by a discussion. The discussions are going to be an hour and a half, and the second 45 minutes of each of those